On November 11, 1918, representatives of Austria-Hungary signed an armistice with Italy at Villa Giusti near Padua. The empire acknowledged defeat. Its armies would withdraw. The terms were harsh, but standard for a losing power. 24 hours later, Emperor Karl issued a proclamation from Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. He recognized Austria's right to determine its own form of government. He stepped back from affairs of state. He did not abdicate, but he stopped claiming authority. Here was the paradox. The state that signed the armistice on the 11th no longer claimed to govern on the 12th. Austria-Hungary negotiated peace as a belligerent empire and dissolved before the ink dried. The entity that lost the war ceased to exist almost simultaneously with its surrender. This was not a gradual decline. 51 million people lived under Habsburg rule in the summer of 1918. By December, 7 different governments claimed sovereignty over those populations and their territories. The question is not why the empire fell apart. Plenty of states lose wars. The question is how a functioning administrative system, one that collected taxes and conscripted soldiers and ran railways across a dozen language groups, disintegrated in a matter of weeks. The collapse was not inevitable in June of 1918. The empire was losing, yes, but institutions still operated. Ministries in Vienna issued orders. Bureaucrats in Prague and Budapest and Zagreb carried them out. The army remained in the field. Karl had been emperor since 1916, after his great-uncle Franz Joseph died. He was young, 31, and he wanted peace. He also wanted to preserve the state, even if that required restructuring it. In mid-October, Karl issued a manifesto. He promised to transform Austria-Hungary into a federal state. Each nationality would govern its own affairs. Poles, Czechs, South Slavs, Ukrainians. They would have autonomy within a broader framework. Hungary would remain a separate kingdom under the same crown, as it had been since the Compromise of 1867. But the Austrian half of the empire would become a federation. The manifesto was a signal. It acknowledged that the old centralized system could not hold, but it also revealed weakness. Karl offered autonomy without specifying how power would be divided, who would control the military, or what borders these new autonomous regions would have. He opened the door to change, but provided no mechanism to manage it. National leaders across the empire read the document and concluded that if autonomy was on the table, full independence was within reach. The military situation made everything worse. By September, the Central Powers were collapsing on multiple fronts. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29th, exposing Austria-Hungary's southern flank. Ottoman forces were retreating in the Middle East. Germany was buckling under pressure in France. Austria-Hungary's armies, already exhausted by 4 years of war, began to fracture along national lines. Czech units refused orders. South Slav soldiers deserted. Polish and Ukrainian troops stopped cooperating with Austrian command. These were not mutinies driven by political ideology or coordinated planning. Soldiers simply decided that dying for an empire that might not exist in a month made no sense. Officers, many of whom came from the same national backgrounds as their men, did not push hard to enforce discipline. Some quietly sympathized. Others recognized that deploying force against entire units would trigger open revolt. The Austro-Hungarian High Command requested an armistice on October 27th. Negotiations began immediately, but the process moved slowly. In the gap between the request and the signing, everything unraveled. On October 28th, the National Committee in Prague issued a declaration. Czechoslovakia was now an independent state. The declaration was not a plea or a petition. It was a unilateral act. The committee seized government buildings. It took control of railways and postal services. It established its own police force. The Austro-Hungarian governor in Prague did not resist. He lacked the troops to suppress the takeover, and even if he had them, it was unclear whether they would obey. In Zagreb, the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs declared independence from Hungary on October 29th. The council claimed authority over South Slav territories within the empire. This was a complicated claim. Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs had different histories, different legal relationships to Vienna and Budapest, and different ideas about what a South Slav state should look like. But they agreed on one thing: they would not remain under Habsburg rule. Hungary broke next. On October 30th, the Hungarian National Council took power in Budapest. Count Mihaly Károly, a liberal aristocrat who had opposed the war, became prime minister. On October 31st, Hungary formally severed its union with Austria. The Compromise of 1867, which had created the dual monarchy, was dead. Hungary would chart its own course. Vienna was now governing a shrinking core. Bohemia was gone. Hungary was gone. South Slav territories were declaring for new states. Galicia, the empire's northeastern province, was fragmenting into Polish and Ukrainian zones. The Italian front had collapsed. Italian forces were occupying Trieste and moving into territories promised to Italy by the Allies in earlier negotiations. Karl's government faced a decision. It could attempt to suppress these secessions by force, or it could recognize them. Suppression was not realistic. The army had dissolved as a unified instrument. Units that remained loyal were scattered, undersupplied, and demoralized. Deploying Austrian or Hungarian troops against Czech or South Slav populations would require soldiers willing to kill their former comrades. Those soldiers did not exist in sufficient numbers. Recognition was not a generous concession. It was the acknowledgement of facts. The national councils were already functioning as governments. They controlled territory. They commanded local loyalty. The alternative to recognition was not restored imperial authority. It was chaos. Karl issued his proclamation on November 11th. He acknowledged Austria's right to self-determination. He did not extend the same recognition to the other nationalities because they had already taken it. His statement applied only to the German-speaking core that remained. Even this was ambiguous. He did not abdicate. He described his withdrawal as temporary, a step back to allow the Austrian people to decide their future. But he did not dissolve the monarchy legally. He simply stopped exercising power. On November 12th, the Provisional National Assembly in Vienna declared German Austria a republic. The assembly was composed of representatives from German-speaking regions. It claimed sovereignty over territories it hoped to include in a new Austrian state. It also expressed the desire to unite with Germany. This was immediately problematic. The Allied powers had no intention of allowing a defeated Austria to merge with a defeated Germany and create a larger German state in Central Europe. The speed of collapse left a vacuum. In late October, the empire still existed on maps and in international law. By mid-November, 7 entities claimed to be its successors. Czechoslovakia controlled Bohemia and Moravia. Hungary governed the Central Plains. The National Council in Zagreb claimed Croatia, Slavonia, and Dalmatia. Poland was reconstituting itself from territories that had been divided among Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia. Ukraine was attempting to establish a state in Galicia. Romania moved into Transylvania. Italy occupied the Adriatic coast. None of these borders were settled. The national councils issued declarations, but declarations do not create borders. Borders require control, and control required force. In the weeks following the armistice, the successor states began to fight each other. The most violent disputes erupted in territories where multiple national claims overlapped and where strategic resources made the stakes unbearable. The town of Teschen, located in Silesia, became one of the first battlegrounds. Teschen sat on rich coal deposits and controlled railway lines connecting Vienna, Prague, and Krakow. Both the new Czechoslovak state and the reconstituting Polish state claimed it. In late January 1919, Czech forces moved into the region. Polish militias resisted. Small-scale fighting broke out. The conflict was brief but bitter. The Allies eventually imposed a temporary division, but neither side accepted the outcome as permanent. The dispute poisoned Czech-Polish relations for 2 decades. Further south, the province of Carinthia became contested between the new Austrian Republic and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The southern part of Carinthia had a significant Slovene population. Yugoslav forces moved north in November 1918 and occupied the town of Klagenfurt. The Austrians protested. The Allies were reluctant to let Yugoslavia expand too far into what had been German-speaking territory. A plebiscite was scheduled for October 1920. The vote went in favor of remaining with Austria, partly because economic ties to the rest of Austria were strong, partly because the Yugoslav military occupation had alienated some of the local population. The result left a Slovene minority inside Austria and created resentment on both sides of the new border. In the east, the city of Lemberg, known to Poles as Lwów and to Ukrainians as Lviv, became the center of a different conflict. The city had been the capital of the Austrian province of Galicia. It had a mixed population: Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and others. When the empire collapsed, both Polish and Ukrainian national councils claimed it. On November 1, 1918, Ukrainian forces took control of the city. A week later, Polish forces counterattacked. Fighting lasted for weeks. The Poles eventually secured the city. The Ukrainian attempt to establish an independent state in eastern Galicia failed. The region was incorporated into the new Polish state. Tens of thousands died in the fighting. The conflict left a legacy of ethnic hostility that never fully healed. Hungary faced its own dismemberment. On October 31st, Hungary had broken its union with Austria. A liberal government under Count Mihaly Karolyi took power in Budapest. Karolyi hoped to negotiate a peace settlement that would preserve as much Hungarian territory as possible. He believed that cooperating with the Allies and granting autonomy to national minorities would earn goodwill. He was wrong. Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens all had claims on Hungarian territory. The Allies supported those claims. In November, Romanian forces crossed into Transylvania. Czech forces moved into Upper Hungary. Serbian forces occupied the southern regions. The Hungarian government protested but had no military capacity to resist. Karolyi's government collapsed in March 1919. A communist revolution led by Bela Kun seized power. Kun's regime attempted to resist the occupation by force. The Hungarian Red Army briefly pushed back against Czech and Romanian forces. The effort failed. Romanian troops marched into Budapest in August. Kun fled. The Romanians occupied the capital for months, stripping factories and railways of equipment before withdrawing. By the time a new conservative government took power, Hungary had lost 2/3 of its territory and 60% of its population. The treaties that formalized these losses left millions of ethnic Hungarians living in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Hungarian political class never accepted the partition. Revising the Treaty of Trianon became the central goal of Hungarian foreign policy for the next 20 years. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919. Representatives of the Allied powers gathered to settle the terms of peace. The defeated Central Powers were not invited to negotiate. They would be presented with treaties and told to sign. The successor states of Austria-Hungary sent delegations to Paris to argue their cases. Each state brought maps, statistics, and historical arguments to justify its territorial claims. The maps did not agree. Every border was disputed. The principle of self-determination, proclaimed by President Woodrow Wilson, was supposed to guide the settlement. In practice, self-determination was applied selectively. The Allies were willing to recognize the independence of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia because those states could serve as counterweights to Germany and Russia. They were less willing to grant self-determination to Germans in Austria or Hungarians in Transylvania. The treaties were shaped as much by strategic calculation as by principle. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, signed in September 1919, formalized the dissolution of Austria. The new Austrian Republic was reduced to a small landlocked state. It lost Bohemia and Moravia to Czechoslovakia, Galicia to Poland, Bukovina to Romania, South Tyrol and Trieste to Italy, and the southern territories to Yugoslavia. The treaty forbade Austria from uniting with Germany. It imposed reparations. It limited the size of the Austrian army. The Austrian delegation protested that the treaty left a state that could not survive economically. The Allies did not care. Austria signed. The Treaty of Trianon, signed in June 1920, imposed even harsher terms on Hungary. Hungary lost territory to Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Austria. The new borders placed 1/3 of all ethnic Hungarians outside the Hungarian state. The treaty imposed reparations and military restrictions. The Hungarian delegation called the terms a death sentence. They signed anyway. They had no alternative. The successor states inherited the administrative machinery of the old empire, but they had to adapt it to new purposes. The Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy had been multilingual and professionalized. Officials were trained to serve the empire, not a national community. When the empire dissolved, these officials had to choose. Some transferred their loyalty to the successor states. Others refused and lost their positions. In Czechoslovakia, German-speaking officials who had served the empire were often dismissed and replaced by Czechs. In Yugoslavia, the new government tried to integrate officials from the former Austrian, Hungarian, and Serbian administrations. The process was chaotic. Competence and loyalty did not always align. The economic integration that had characterized the empire was shattered. Austria-Hungary had been a customs union. Goods, capital, and labor moved freely across internal borders. Railways connected Vienna to Prague, Budapest, Krakow, and Trieste. Industries in Bohemia supplied markets in Hungary. Agriculture in the Hungarian plains fed cities in Austria. When the empire broke apart, customs barriers appeared. Each successor state pursued its own economic policy. Trade that had once been internal became international and subject to tariffs. The disruption was severe. Factories in Austria lost access to raw materials. Hungarian agriculture lost access to urban markets. Inflation spiked. Unemployment rose. The economic shock of partition compounded the devastation of the war. The new borders also created refugee flows. Ethnic Hungarians fled from Transylvania into Hungary. Germans left Bohemia and Moravia for Austria. Poles moved east into the new Polish state. Jews, who had formed significant communities in many cities, found themselves minorities in hostile environments. The successor states signed minority protection treaties as a condition of recognition by the Allies, but enforcement was weak. Discrimination and violence against minorities became common. The old empire had not been a model of justice or equality, but it had provided a legal framework that allowed different ethnic groups to coexist within a single state. The new national states claimed to represent the will of their peoples, but those peoples were never as homogeneous as the nationalist rhetoric suggested. Czechoslovakia included Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, and Ruthenians. Yugoslavia included Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnian Muslims, Macedonians, and Albanians. Romania absorbed large Hungarian and German populations. Poland included Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, and Germans. Each of these states struggled to manage its internal diversity. The interwar period revealed the fragility of the settlement. The borders imposed by the treaties were not accepted as legitimate by the defeated states, or by many of the minorities trapped on the wrong side of the lines. Nationalist movements in Hungary, Austria, and Germany sought to revise the treaties. Ethnic conflicts within the successor states undermined political stability. Czechoslovakia managed to maintain a democratic system for 2 decades, but it faced constant pressure from its German minority and from Slovak demands for autonomy. Yugoslavia was plagued by Serb-Croat rivalry. Romania's political system became increasingly authoritarian. Poland struggled with economic underdevelopment and ethnic tension. The collapse of Austria-Hungary reshaped the map of Europe, but it did not resolve the fundamental problem that had plagued the empire: how to organize political life in a region of extraordinary ethnic and linguistic diversity. The empire had attempted to manage that diversity through bureaucracy and dynastic loyalty. The attempt failed when military defeat removed the coercive power that held the system together. The successor states attempted to manage diversity through nation building and assimilation. That attempt also failed. Within 2 decades, the region was engulfed in another war. The borders drawn in 1919 and 1920 did not survive. Some were redrawn by force in the 1940s. Others changed again after the Cold War ended. The question of how to organize Central and Eastern Europe remains unresolved. The disappearance of Austria-Hungary was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over months. The military collapse in October 1918 removed the empire's capacity to enforce its authority. The National Council seized the opportunity to declare independence. The gap between collapse and treaty ratification allowed the successor states to establish facts on the ground. The treaties ratified those facts, but did not create lasting peace. The empire's disappearance left a legacy of unresolved territorial disputes, ethnic resentments, and economic dislocation that shaped European politics for decades. The treaties did more than redraw borders. They dismantled the economic infrastructure that had made Austria-Hungary function as a single unit. For 50 years, the empire had operated as a customs union. Raw materials moved freely from Galicia to Bohemia, from Transylvania to Vienna. Coal from Silesia fueled steel mills in Lower Austria. Hungarian grain fed Vienna and Prague. The empire's railway network, one of the most extensive in Europe, had been designed to connect regions within a single administrative system, not to serve separate nation-states with competing interests. When the successor states erected customs barriers, they severed those connections. Hungary lost access to its former markets in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Austria, cut off from the agricultural lands of the former empire, faced food shortages. Czechoslovakia inherited most of the empire's industrial capacity, but struggled to find new trading partners. Railway lines that had once linked Vienna to Prague, Budapest to Krakow, now crossed international frontiers. Freight had to be unloaded and reloaded at each border. Tariffs replaced free movement. The economic logic that had sustained the empire's prosperity vanished. The human cost of partition was immediate and measurable. Millions of people found themselves living in states where they were now ethnic minorities. Roughly 3 million Germans remained in Czechoslovakia, concentrated in the border regions known as the Sudetenland. Over 3 million Hungarians ended up in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, and others were divided by the new borders. The successor states promised to protect minority rights, but those promises were embedded in treaty clauses that had no enforcement mechanism. Within a few years, policies of assimilation and marginalization became common. The displacement was not only ethnic. Career civil servants who had spent decades working for the imperial administration now had to choose a nationality. Officers in the imperial army had to declare loyalty to one of the successor states or face unemployment. The Habsburg bureaucracy had been multilingual by necessity. A Czech clerk might work in Vienna, a Hungarian magistrate in Galicia, a Croatian officer in Bosnia. That mobility disappeared. The new states wanted nationals in their administrations, Language laws excluded those who did not speak the dominant language fluently. Thousands of former imperial officials found themselves dismissed, pensioned off, or forced into early retirement. The legal dissolution of the empire was messy and prolonged. Emperor Karl had issued his proclamation in November 1918, acknowledging Austria's right to determine its own government. He did not, however, abdicate. He withdrew from public affairs, but retained the title. The Austrian Republic, declared on November 12th, existed in a legal gray zone. Was it a new state or the continuation of the empire under a different government? The question mattered for international recognition, treaty obligations, and property rights. The Republic claimed to be the legal successor to the Austrian half of the empire, but rejected responsibility for the empire's war debts. Hungary took a similar position. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, signed in September 1919, formalized Austria's borders and status. The treaty reduced Austria to a landlocked state of 6.5 million people. It included clauses prohibiting Austria from uniting with Germany, a provision designed to prevent a large German state from dominating Central Europe. Austria was required to accept responsibility for the war, pay reparations, and reduce its military to a token force. The treaty also dissolved the Habsburg monarchy legally. Karl was stripped of his titles and exiled. In 1921, he attempted twice to reclaim the Hungarian throne. Both attempts failed. He was deported to Madeira, where he died in 1922 at the age of 34. Hungary's treatment was harsher. The Treaty of Trianon, signed in June 1920, reduced Hungary to less than a third of its former size. The kingdom lost Transylvania to Romania, Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia, Croatia and parts of the Banat to Yugoslavia, and a strip of land to Austria. Over 3 million ethnic Hungarians were now living outside Hungary's borders. The treaty was received in Hungary as a national catastrophe. Maps showing the pre-Trianon borders became symbols of loss. Revisionist sentiment dominated Hungarian politics throughout the interwar period. The slogan "Nem, nem, soha," no, no, never, expressed the refusal to accept the treaty as final. The question of what Austria-Hungary had been and why it had collapsed became a subject of bitter debate. For the successor states, the empire was recast as a prison of nations. Czech, Slovak, Romanian, and South Slav historians portrayed their nations as having struggled for centuries against Habsburg oppression. Independence was presented as the natural and inevitable result of national awakening. This narrative served the political needs of the new states, but simplified the historical reality. Many citizens of the empire had not identified primarily as Czechs, Slovaks, or Croats. Regional, religious, and class identities often mattered more than ethnicity. The empire had not been a monolithic oppressor. It had been a bureaucratic structure that accommodated multiple identities within a single legal framework. For Austrians and Hungarians, especially those who had lost property, status, or homeland, the collapse was a tragedy. The empire, in this view, had been a stabilizing force in a region of ethnic complexity. Its disappearance unleashed nationalism and violence. The successor states, far from liberating oppressed peoples, had created new oppressions. This perspective was not without merit. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania all struggled with ethnic tensions. Minority populations faced discrimination and political exclusion. The promise of self-determination applied selectively. The Sudeten Germans, the Hungarians in Transylvania, the Ukrainians in Poland, none of these groups received the right to form their own states. The violence in the disputed zones did not end with the treaties. In Burgenland, armed clashes between Austrian and Hungarian irregulars continued into 1921. The region, a narrow strip of land with a mixed German and Hungarian population, had been awarded to Austria by the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Hungary resisted the transfer. Local militias, some backed by the Hungarian government, Others, operating independently, fought to keep the territory. The conflict ended only after international mediation and a plebiscite in the city of Sopron, which voted to remain part of Hungary. In Upper Silesia, the situation was even more complex. The region, rich in coal and industry, was claimed by both Poland and Czechoslovakia. The Treaty of Versailles had awarded most of Silesia to Poland, but the city of Teschen and the surrounding area remained contested. In January 1919, Czech forces occupied the city. Polish forces counterattacked. Skirmishes continued until the Allies imposed a ceasefire and later divided the territory. Neither side accepted the settlement as fair. The dispute poisoned Czech-Polish relations throughout the interwar period. The dismantling of Austria-Hungary also created a massive refugee crisis. Ethnic Germans fled from Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Hungarians left Romania and Slovakia. Jews, who had often identified with the empire rather than with any particular nationality, faced increasing hostility in the successor states. The new governments promoted assimilationist policies that targeted minority languages, schools, and cultural institutions. Those who refused to assimilate or who were deemed unassimilable faced expulsion or worse. The economic disintegration of the empire had long-term consequences. The customs union had allowed specialization. Bohemia and Moravia produced manufactured goods. Hungary supplied grain and livestock. Galicia provided oil. When the tariff barriers went up, each successor state tried to become economically self-sufficient. The result was inefficiency and duplication. Small states with limited resources attempted to build complete industrial sectors. Agricultural productivity declined as markets shrank. Unemployment rose. The Great Depression, when it arrived in 1929, hit the region especially hard. The new states also inherited the empire's debt. Austria and Hungary, as the legal successors to the Habsburg monarchy, were saddled with reparations, obligations. The other successor states refused to assume responsibility. This created financial crises in Vienna and Budapest. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. The Austrian crown became worthless. The government had to introduce a new currency, the shilling, in 1925. Hungary underwent a similar crisis. The economic instability undermined the legitimacy of the democratic governments that had emerged after the war. Austria faced an additional problem. The new republic was too small to be economically viable on its own and too large for its capital. Vienna, with nearly 2 million inhabitants, had been designed to be the administrative center of an empire. It now governed a state of 6.5 million. The city's industries, which had supplied the empire, lost their markets. Unemployment soared. The social democratic government that controlled the city launched ambitious public housing projects and social programs, but these efforts could not compensate for the loss of the empire's economic base. Hungary's situation was different, but no less difficult. The country retained a large agricultural sector, but it lost access to its former markets. The successor states imposed tariffs on Hungarian grain to protect their own farmers. Hungary also lost most of its industrial capacity, which had been concentrated in the territories transferred to Czechoslovakia and Romania. The result was economic stagnation and political instability. Hungary experienced a brief communist revolution in 1919, followed by a counter-revolutionary regime that consolidated power under Admiral Miklos Horthy. The Horthy regime pursued revisionist policies aimed at recovering the lost territories, but it lacked the military strength to act unilaterally. The collapse of Austria-Hungary also transformed the geopolitical balance of Central Europe. The empire, whatever its internal weaknesses, had been a great power. Its disappearance created a vacuum. Germany, though defeated and weakened, remained the largest state in the region. The successor states, individually weak, lacked the capacity to counterbalance German influence. France attempted to create a system of alliances, the so-called Little Entente, linking Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. The goal was to prevent both German and Hungarian revisionism. The system functioned as long as France remained strong and committed, but it proved fragile when tested. The question of how to organize Central and Eastern Europe after Austria-Hungary had no easy answer. The empire's collapse demonstrated that a multi-ethnic state could not survive military defeat and the loss of coercive capacity. The successor states demonstrated that ethnic nation-states in a region of mixed populations generated their own conflicts. The principle of self-determination, invoked to justify the partition, was applied inconsistently. Some nationalities received states, others did not. The borders drawn in 1919 and 1920 satisfied no one completely and left many deeply aggrieved. The treaties also embedded contradictions that would shape European politics for decades. Austria and Hungary were forbidden from uniting, but the German-speaking populations of both states increasingly looked to Germany as a potential protector. The Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, the Germans in Poland, and the Austrians themselves became targets of Nazi propaganda in the 1930s. Hitler exploited the resentments created by the post-war settlement to justify territorial expansion. The annexation of Austria in 1938 and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1939 were presented as corrections of the injustices of Versailles and Saint-Germain. The empire's disappearance did not erase the underlying problem it had tried to manage. Central and Eastern Europe remained a region of extraordinary diversity. No single principle, dynastic loyalty, bureaucratic efficiency, national self-determination proved sufficient to organize political life in a way that minimized conflict and maximized stability. The empire had failed. The successor states also failed. The question remains unresolved even now, more than a century later. The borders have changed. The regimes have changed. The challenge of accommodating ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity in a framework that respects both individual rights and collective identities persists. Austria-Hungary disappeared because the war